The foreman said a woman had no business breaking horses. She broke the meanest one he had. The horse was called Perdition, though he had been called other things by the men he had thrown. He was a 16-hand blue roan Mustang with a white wall eye and a vicious temperament that had earned him his name through a systematic campaign of violence against every man who had ever climbed on his back. He had thrown 14 riders in 3 years, broken 2 arms, cracked 4 ribs, and put 1 cowboy in bed for a month with a dislocated hip. The Hargrove Ranch kept him because he was the finest-looking horse in the territory, and because Wade Hargrove, who owned the ranch, believed that every horse could be broken and that the failure was in the rider, not the animal. The riders disagreed, but their opinions were delivered from the ground, which diminished their authority. Elodie Fenn arrived at the Hargrove Ranch on a morning in April, when the grass was coming up green on the Colorado Range, and the sky was the clear, particular blue that makes cowboys write poetry they will never show anyone. She came on a paint mare that she had trained herself from a half-wild 2-year-old into the steadiest trail horse in 3 territories, with a saddle that had seen more miles than most wagons, and a letter of reference from a ranch in Wyoming that said, in the careful language of men who do not know how to praise without qualification, that Miss Fenn was the finest hand with an unbroken horse they had ever employed, gender notwithstanding. She was 27, lean and sun-darkened, with her hair cut short because long hair and green horses do not mix, and she wore men's trousers and a split skirt over them, and boots that were scuffed down to the underlayer of leather. She did not look like what the Hargrove Ranch expected, which was a problem that belonged to the Hargrove Ranch and not to Elodie. She had been riding since she was 4, on her father's ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, where the horses ran half wild on mountain grass, and the only way to catch them was to outthink them, and she had been outthinking horses ever since. The foreman was a man named Dillard. He was 50, barrel-chested and bow-legged, experienced, competent with cattle, and adequate with horses, and in possession of the particular certainty that comes from doing the same job for 20 years without being told he was wrong. He looked at Elodie the way a man looks at a piece of equipment that has been delivered in the wrong size. The job posting said horsebreaker, he said. I am a horsebreaker. The job posting did not say woman horsebreaker. The job posting did not say man horsebreaker either. It said horsebreaker. That is what I am. Dillard looked at Wade Hargrove, who was leaning against the corral fence, with the amused expression of a man who owns 14,000 acres and does not concern himself with the details of hiring. Hargrove shrugged. The shrug said, she has a letter, she came a long way, and I want to see what happens. All right, Dillard said. You can start with the 3-year-olds in the South Corral. Gentle work. Nothing that will hurt you. I did not come here for gentle work. You came here for what I tell you to do. I came here to break horses. Show me the horses that need breaking. Dillard showed her the 3-year-olds because Dillard was the foreman, and the foreman decided who broke what. The 3-year-olds were young and green and nervous, the kind of horses that most ranches start their new hands on, because the stakes are low and the bruises are manageable. Elodie broke 3 of them in 2 days. Not the rough, dominating breaking that was common on ranches, where the horse was fought into submission, but a patient, methodical process that began with her standing in the corral and doing nothing until the horse came to her, and continued with groundwork and long reining and the gradual introduction of weight, so that by the time she climbed into the saddle, the horse had already decided that the saddle was not a threat and the woman in it was not an enemy. The cowboys watched from the fence rails, their boots hooked on the lower bar and their hats pushed back and their coffee growing cold in their hands. They watched the way men watch anything they have not seen before, with skepticism first, then curiosity, then the grudging acknowledgement that arrives when competence is too obvious to deny. They had been breaking horses with force their entire careers, and the force worked, mostly, but it left the horses nervous and hard-mouthed and prone to the kind of explosive rebellion that Perdition had perfected. Elodie's horses were different. They came out of their first weeks under saddle, not cowed or beaten into compliance, but genuinely calm, ears relaxed, eyes soft, mouths light on the bit. They responded to her weight and her voice, and the subtle shifts of her seat, that communicated direction without requiring the bit to do the talking. Reed Maddox noticed first. He was 29, one of the senior hands, a horseman himself, though he would not have claimed the title in Elodie's presence, because her skill made his look approximate. He was tall and quiet, with dark hair that curled at his collar, and the particular economy of movement that good horsemen develop. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed, every gesture purposeful. He watched Elodie work the 3-year-olds, and he understood, with the clarity of someone who knows enough to recognize mastery, that she was better than anyone on the ranch, including Dillard, including himself. "Where did you learn that?" he asked her on the second evening, standing at the corral fence while the horses settled. "From a man in Montana who learned it from a Crow horseman who learned it from his grandfather. It is not my method. It is older than any of us. It works. It works because it is not about breaking. It is about asking. A horse that is asked will give you more than a horse that is told." Dillard did not ask and did not want to learn. He watched Elodie's work with the expression of a man whose authority is being undermined by results, which is the most dangerous kind of undermining because it cannot be argued with. He continued to assign her the easy horses, the 3-year-olds, the gentle colts, the mares that barely needed breaking at all, and he kept the difficult horses for the male riders, who continued to approach them with force and continued to get thrown with regularity. 2 weeks into her employment, Elodie walked into the barn where Perdition was kept. The horse stood in the largest stall, 16 hands of coiled muscle and bad intention, and when Elodie approached the stall door, he flattened his ears and swung his hindquarters toward her and kicked the wall with a force that shook the barn. She did not flinch. She stood at the door and looked at the horse, and the horse looked at her, and the moment held the particular tension of 2 wills meeting in a space that was too small for both. "That one is not yours," Dillard said from behind her. "That one is why I came here. That horse has thrown every man who has sat on him. I am not every man. No, you are not any man. And that horse will kill you. That horse is afraid. Afraid horses fight. I do not fight horses." Dillard forbade it. Elodie appealed to Hargrove. Hargrove, who had been watching Elodie's work with the 3-year-olds and who had the rancher's instinct for talent, overruled his foreman for the first time in 15 years. "Let her try," Hargrove said. He had not become a man who owned 14,000 acres by ignoring talent when it stood in front of him. "She will get hurt," Dillard said. "She might. That is her decision. It is my responsibility. It is her body and her skill. Let her try." Elodie began with Perdition the next morning. She did not enter the stall. She stood outside it. She stood outside it for 3 hours, doing nothing, saying nothing, while the horse snorted and paced and kicked and performed every threatening behavior in his repertoire. When the repertoire was exhausted and the horse stood still, breathing hard, she walked away. She came back the next day and did the same thing, and the next, and the next. 4 days of standing at the stall door, 4 days of the horse raging and then tiring and then standing still, and on the 5th day, when Elodie stood at the door, Perdition did not rage. He stood. He watched her. His ears came forward, not pinned, not flattened, but forward, which is the posture of a horse that is curious rather than hostile. On the 6th day, she opened the stall door and stepped inside. She stood with her back to the wall and waited. Perdition circled her. He circled her 3 times, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body and the wind of his movement. And on the 3rd circuit, he stopped and extended his nose toward her hand and breathed. She touched him. She laid her hand on his neck and felt the muscle trembling beneath the hide, not with rage, but with the particular tremor of an animal that has been handled roughly and is waiting for the roughness to start again. It did not start. Her hand stayed soft. Her voice stayed low. She stood in the stall with the horse that had thrown 14 men, and she did not try to dominate him. She tried to understand him, and the difference between those 2 approaches was the difference between what Perdition had known and what Elodie offered, and the horse recognized the difference the way all creatures recognize kindness, slowly, skeptically, and then all at once. Reed watched from the barn door. He watched every day, arriving before Elodie and leaving after, finding reasons to be in the barn that had nothing to do with his own duties and everything to do with the woman in the stall. He watched the way a man watches something that is changing his understanding of his own profession, not just the technique, but the philosophy beneath it, the idea that strength was not the only tool and perhaps not even the best one. The watching changed him, and the change was the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. It took 3 weeks, 3 weeks of groundwork and long reining, and the patient, incremental building of trust between a woman and a horse that the world had decided was unbreakable. On the 21st day, Elodie carried a saddle blanket into the stall and laid it across Perdition's back, and the horse turned his head to look at it, and then turned back to his hay. She added the saddle the following morning, cinching it slowly while the horse stood still, his breathing steady, his ears forward. On the 22nd day, she put her weight in the stirrup and the horse stood still. On the 23rd day, she swung into the saddle and sat there, and the horse stood still, and then walked and then trotted, and then loped around the corral in a smooth, balanced, collected canter that made every cowboy at the fence stop talking, and every mouth drop open, and every opinion about women and horses rearrange itself permanently. Dillard watched from the porch. He did not applaud. He did not congratulate her. He stood on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the expression of a man who has been proven wrong in the most public way possible and is deciding whether to accept it or resent it. To his credit, after a long moment, he took off his hat and put it back on, which among men of his generation and temperament was the equivalent of a standing ovation. It was not grace, but it was the first step toward it, and Elodie accepted it as such. Reed was waiting at the corral gate when Elodie rode Perdition out. The horse was calm. The horse was, for the first time in 3 years, something that resembled a horse that trusted the person on his back, and the transformation was so complete that it seemed less like training and more like translation, as though Elodie had simply learned Perdition's language and spoken it back to him. "You made that look easy," Reed said. "It was not easy. It was simple. Simple and easy are different things." "They are. I am learning that." He was learning other things too. He was learning that competence in a person is attractive in a way that has nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the particular magnetism of someone who is excellent at what they do and does not apologize for it. He was learning that Elodie Fenn, who cut her hair short and wore trousers and talked to horses in a voice so low it was nearly silent, was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and the remarkableness was not despite the unconventional parts of her, but because of them. He told her so in July, standing at the corral fence at the end of a day so long and hot that the air itself seemed tired. He told her on a bench outside the bunkhouse, simply, the way horsemen say things, without decoration, without performance, with the directness of a person who values clarity over style. "I admire you," he said. "More than admire. I do not have a better word for it yet, but when I find it, I will say it." Elodie looked at him. She looked at him with the same direct, assessing gaze she gave to every horse, not measuring his value, but reading his intention, determining whether the thing being offered was genuine or just another version of the performance that most men put on when they decided they wanted something from a woman. "You could start with honest," she said. "That is always a good word. Honest, and then whatever comes after honest. What comes after honest is trust, and after trust is everything else." They married in the fall, on a Saturday when the aspen on the ridgeline had turned gold and the air smelled like sage and the first frost of the season lay silver on the grass, at the corral fence where Perdition stood on the other side and watched the ceremony with the mild interest of a horse that has finally decided that humans are not entirely terrible. Dillard attended, wearing a clean shirt for the occasion. He did not smile, but he shook Elodie's hand, and the handshake was firm and lasted longer than a handshake needs to last, which was his way of saying what he could not bring himself to say with words. Hargrove gave them 20 acres and a cabin at the edge of the ranch, and Elodie continued breaking horses with the method that was older than any of them. She trained Reed in the same approach, and he took to it with the humility of a man who has found a better way and is not too proud to learn it from the person he loves. And within a year, The Hargrove Ranch had the calmest, most reliable string of saddle horses in Colorado, and the reputation spread the way Elodie's own reputation had spread, by word of mouth, from one honest man to another. And Reed worked beside her, and learned from her, and never once resented that his wife knew more about horses than he did, because he understood that love is not a competition, and the best horseman he had ever seen happened to be the woman he loved, and both of those things were reasons for gratitude.